After a failed coup in Burkina Faso, Denmark and Cuba stood with Ibrahim Traoré. But wait, why would a Western power reverse its stance? And why is a Caribbean island backing Africa's most defiant leader? Let's find out. In August 2024, Denmark made what looked like a clean break. It announced plans to shut down its embassies in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, a move portrayed as part of a new Africa strategy. On paper, it sounded like bureaucracy. In reality, it was a signal. Denmark was distancing itself from the Sahel. These three nations had left the West's orbit, aligning with alternative powers like Russia and China. For Denmark and its allies, this wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unacceptable. The embassy closures were less about diplomacy and more about drawing a line. At the time, few noticed. The world had grown used to the idea that the West could withdraw, punish, and isolate African nations that stepped out of line. The Sahel was seen as unstable, and the narrative was that these military-led governments were illegitimate. By cutting ties, Denmark was trying to preserve its image and avoid political complications. But what Denmark didn't anticipate was what came next: a failed coup attempt in Burkina Faso that would backfire spectacularly and turn the country into a symbol of defiant African sovereignty. When the coup failed in April 2025, something shifted in Europe. The people of Burkina Faso didn't panic. They rallied. The streets didn't fall silent. They erupted with support for Traoré. Videos of the crowds, the chants, the flags, they shocked foreign capitals. This wasn't a frightened population. It was a mobilized one. And suddenly Denmark found itself on the wrong side of public sentiment in Africa. Then came the quiet U-turn. Despite its earlier embassy closure announcement, Denmark never completed its exit from Burkina Faso. The embassy in Ouagadougou remained quietly functional. And barely a week after the failed coup, Denmark's special envoy for the Sahel and Great Lakes region arrived in Burkina Faso for high-level talks. A diplomatic reset was underway, but there was no press conference, no triumphant handshake. Just a quiet visit, a quiet meeting, and a quiet shift. This wasn't just a policy update. It was a recognition of reality. Denmark needed to engage with Traoré, not isolate him. Why? Because he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was setting the tone. The coup attempt had done something no Western country expected. It had backfired so completely that it made Traoré untouchable. Not just militarily, but diplomatically. He now had the people behind him, African youth rallying for him, and even countries like Russia and Cuba standing by his side. Denmark understood something else too. If it left now, completely and publicly, it would hand that space to others, to powers less interested in Western values and more interested in long-term partnerships. Russia, China, and Turkey, all were already building influence in the region. If Denmark vanished, it would be forgotten. Worse, it would lose future leverage in West Africa. That's not how the West operates. It wants options, and so Denmark stayed, not out of affection, but calculation. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. What makes this move so significant is that Denmark didn't try to spin it. It didn't pretend the embassy never planned to close. Instead, it let the reset speak for itself. This was diplomacy in retreat, but masked with politeness. Denmark began to use terms like sovereignty, partnership, and mutual respect in official communication with Burkina Faso. These weren't just buzzwords, they were admissions. The old tone of control had to go. Traoré had changed the rules of the game, and if Denmark wanted to stay relevant, it had to play by them. Even more telling was what Denmark didn't say. It didn't bring up human rights concerns. It didn't issue warnings. It didn't lecture Traoré about military transitions. That silence said more than any statement ever could. It was a recognition that Traoré, for now, was untouchable, and that the West had run out of cards to play. This reset wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was a warning to other Western nations. The era of dominance by withdrawal was over. Africa no longer reacted to abandonment with begging. It responded with a replacement. For every embassy closed, another opened. backed by powers who didn't condescend, who didn't dictate terms. Denmark's quiet return wasn't an act of charity or diplomacy. It was survival. So yes, Denmark stood with Traoré. Not loudly, not proudly, but undeniably. And if even a NATO-aligned European country was willing to circle back, then a new message was taking shape across the world. Traoré was not alone. But what happens when Traoré comes out of loyalty? Who stood with him not because they had to, but because they believed in the same cause? That's where Cuba comes in. While Denmark re-entered the picture with quiet caution, Cuba never needed to return, because it never left. Its position was not reactive, not strategic, and certainly not reluctant. Cuba's alignment with Ibrahim Traoré wasn't born in a moment of geopolitical convenience. It was rooted in something older, deeper, and more dangerous to the West: revolutionary solidarity. When the coup attempt against Traoré failed in April 2025, Cuba's reaction was swift, public, and unwavering. Just days after the failed operation, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez touched down in Ouagadougou. No mystery, no delay, no monitoring the situation. He came with a clear message. Cuba stands with Burkina Faso, with its people, and with its leader. This wasn't just a diplomatic courtesy, it was a reminder, a signal fired across continents, that Cuba and Burkina Faso have always shared more than formal ties. Their bond was not built in embassies, it was built in a struggle. To understand Cuba's position today, we have to go back nearly half a century, to the revolutionary wave that swept across Africa and Latin America during the Cold War. In the 1980s, Thomas Sankara, the legendary anti-imperialist leader of Burkina Faso, openly admired Fidel Castro. He called Cuba an example of how a small, independent, post-colonial nation could challenge superpowers without losing its soul. And Cuba, in turn, saw Sankara as a kindred spirit in the global South, a brother in the fight against neo-colonialism. That bond didn't die with Sankara's assassination in 1987. It lived on through culture, medical cooperation, education, and ideology. And when Traoré rose to power, many in Cuba saw something familiar: the return of Sankara's courage, not just in speech, but in policy. Traoré wasn't offering Western powers smooth talk. He was offering the African people real sovereignty, economic reform, and military dignity. For Havana, that wasn't just admirable, it was familiar. That's why Cuba didn't flinch during the coup attempt. There was no hesitation, no backroom assessment of risk. The relationship was not transactional, it was revolutionary. When Bruno Rodriguez met with Burkina Faso's leadership in April 2025, he brought with him not only political support, but practical plans. Expansion of Cuba, Burkina Faso cooperation in health, agriculture, and education. The same areas where Cuba had historically supported African nations without expecting Western approval or corporate contracts in return. This is what separates Cuba from many of Traoré's recent diplomatic visitors. The West often arrives with terms. China arrives with infrastructure. Russia with arms. But Cuba arrives with memory and medicine. For decades, Cuban doctors have served in Africa, often in remote regions that even local governments had neglected. Their support isn't flashy, but it's real. And when Traoré promised to rebuild Burkina Faso's broken systems, Cuba didn't offer funding conditions. It offered hands. This matters, especially now. In the post-coup climate, where Traoré's enemies grow quieter but more cunning, loyalty is currency. The West may talk about sovereignty, but Cuba embodies it. And in doing so, it gives Traoré something no Western nation has: a friend who doesn't calculate value based on leverage. Let's not forget, Cuba is still under a decades-long blockade. It has no access to Western financial systems, no IMF privileges, and no NATO cover. And yet, it continues to survive. Its entire foreign policy is based on principles that defy market logic. Principles like anti-imperialism, national dignity, and South-South cooperation. These are not just slogans. They are operational policies. So when Cuba stands with Traoré, it's not looking for contracts or alliances against enemies. It's continuing a legacy. It sees in Traoré a leader who, like Sankara and Castro, believes that small nations can stand tall if they are honest with their people, and fearless with the world. Western analysts may call this symbolic, but that's a mistake. In global diplomacy, symbolism is strategy. Traoré doesn't need a superpower behind him. He needs legitimacy. And Cuba's visit offered precisely that, not from the language of NATO, but from the voice of global resistance. And here's the most telling part. Cuba didn't have to change its tone. It didn't issue a statement recognizing Burkina Faso's leadership. It already had. It didn't need to rebuild ties. The foundation was never cracked. While other countries scrambled to read the mood and shift positions, Cuba simply showed up, as it always had, as it always will. If Denmark represents the West's slow awakening to the new Africa, Cuba represents the enduring heartbeat of the Revolutionary Alliance, a heartbeat that's getting louder, stronger, and harder for the world to ignore. But Cuba isn't the only one doubling down. There are others, in Africa, Asia, and beyond, who saw the failed coup not as a warning, but as an opportunity to push back against old empires. So, who's next? Who else is choosing to stand with Traoré, not because they were forced to, but because they believe in what he represents? The failed coup in April 2025 wasn't just an internal Burkina Faso crisis. It became a global moment of reckoning. Overnight, the assassination attempt against Traoré stopped being a local event. It became a litmus test. And suddenly, silence wasn't neutral. It was exposure. Every nation, whether through action or absence, revealed where it truly stood. Some rushed to condemn the instability. Others called for dialogue. But a few, like Cuba and later Denmark, chose to stand. This wasn't about diplomacy anymore. This was about ideological alignment. And Traoré's government forced every observer to either acknowledge Burkina Faso's sovereignty or expose their investment in its failure. The world had grown used to coups in Africa, especially in West Africa. In many cases, they were seen as manageable disruptions. But this time, something was different. The coup didn't create fear. It created unity. Instead of collapsing under pressure, the people of Burkina Faso poured into the streets, waving flags, chanting Traoré's name, and openly defying the plotters. Across African social media, a storm of support surged. This wasn't just Burkina Faso nationalism. It was African frustration, boiling over. That energy was contagious. In cities from Bamako to Kinshasa, young people weren't asking whether Traoré would survive. They were declaring that he must. He had become a symbol, not just of military strength, but of refusal. Refusal to obey, refusal to bow, refusal to play the colonial game. And for many governments, particularly those in the West, this was alarming. Not because they feared instability, but because they feared irrelevance. The coup's failure created clarity. Governments had to ask themselves, can we afford to be seen as opposing this wave of African defiance? Or do we quietly adjust our posture and avoid being shut out? It was at this point that global responses began to fracture. Countries with historic colonial interests, France, the UK, even ECOWAS members, appeared uncomfortable, issuing vague statements about transition timelines and returning to civilian rule. Their words were thinly veiled warnings, wrapped in diplomatic jargon. But the timing gave them away. These weren't expressions of concern. They were signals of disapproval, cloaked in protocol. Meanwhile, nations that had long lived outside the Western consensus saw something else, an opening. Countries like Iran, Turkey, Venezuela, and even North Korea, typically dismissed by Western media, saw the failed coup as confirmation of a shifting global tide. They understood the moment for what it was, a clear rejection of foreign-controlled democracy and an embrace of homegrown authority. For them, Traoré wasn't a wild card. He was a player on their team, not because of ideology, but because of independence. The more the West recoiled, the more these nations leaned in, and Africa took note. Suddenly, diplomatic realignments were no longer theoretical. They were visible, measurable, and fast. Embassies that once dictated terms were scrambling to keep access. Defense deals were being renegotiated without the usual gatekeepers. Resource contracts were opening up to non-Western bidders. Even media narratives were splintering, with some African networks openly calling out Western coverage for its bias and selective outrage. The failed coup didn't just isolate Traoré's enemies, it energized his allies, and that forced world powers to adapt in real time. China, for instance, maintained its usual strategic silence but deepened its economic overtures behind the scenes, understanding that in a post-coup landscape, quiet investment was more powerful than loud alliances. Russia, meanwhile, amplified its messaging, portraying Traoré as part of a broader front against Western imperialism, even as it increased military cooperation and advisor deployments in the region. But the most important shift wasn't happening in foreign ministries. It was happening in African minds. Across the continent, the question stopped being who would take over after Traoré and became who else will follow in his path. Conversations in university halls, radio stations, youth forums, and public debates all echoed a similar tone. If Traoré can survive a coup backed by shadows, with no help from traditional powers, then maybe Africa doesn't need the traditional powers at all. This realization marked the true failure of the coup, not just its inability to remove Traoré, but its inability to scare others into submission. Instead of creating a cautionary tale, it inspired a blueprint. And now, every government, every embassy, every analyst watching from abroad must reckon with the fallout. Africa is choosing sides, and it's not choosing the old masters. For countries still clinging to influence through aid, threats, or moral lectures, this is a dangerous moment. Because once a population stops fearing coups and starts celebrating resistance, the usual tools stop working. Sanctions fall flat. Travel bans are mocked. Even media campaigns begin to backfire, feeding the very defiance they're meant to discredit. This is the world the failed coup created. One where standing with Traoré isn't about Burkina Faso anymore. It's about standing with an entire continent's right to self-determination. But this global reckoning raises one final question. Will those who once tried to control Africa now try to reconcile with it? Or will they double down and risk losing it all? The failed coup in Burkina Faso didn't just expose allegiances, it forced the world to answer a deeper question. What does it mean to stand with Africa in 2025? Not just in speeches, not in token gestures, but in action. Because the game has changed, and the continent is no longer measuring loyalty by proximity or aid packages. The new standard is simple, unforgiving, and crystal clear. Do you respect Africa's right to lead itself, or are you still trying to manage it? This line, between respect and control, has now become the defining fault line of global diplomacy. The old empires, once comfortable wielding influence through embassies, press statements, and financial levers, now find themselves exposed by a more honest metric. Not how much money they spend, not how many conferences they host, but whether they support African nations when they step outside the script. And the coup attempt against Ibrahim Traoré was that moment of script-shattering truth. When the bullets didn't bring down his government and the crowds roared louder than the gunfire, a reset began. It wasn't Traoré who blinked. It was the international order. Countries that once felt entitled to instruct African leaders on democracy, development, and defense suddenly found themselves silenced by their irrelevance. Because in this new paradigm, standing with Africa no longer means making donations. It means backing African decisions, even when they challenge you. This is why Cuba's support mattered so deeply, not because it was loud, but because it was unfiltered. And why Denmark's reversal, though subtle, was important, not for its symbolism, but for its surrender to the new rules. They didn't control the conversation anymore. Traoré did. Compare that to the countries still trapped in the old model, the ones who responded to the coup with lectures, veiled threats, or diplomatic cowardice. Their playbook hasn't changed since the 1960s. Reward obedience, punish defiance, and expect silence in return. But that script no longer works. Traoré's government didn't apologize for surviving. It didn't ask for validation. It moved forward, and it let the world catch up, or not. This power shift is what makes the moment so significant. The failed coup didn't just affirm Traoré's leadership, it offered a preview of Africa's future. A future where decisions are made in Ouagadougou, not in Paris. Where sovereignty is practiced, not just promised. And where alliances are chosen based on principle, not colonial leftovers. That future is uncomfortable for many, especially for countries used to exercising soft control under the banner of development. But here's the truth they now face. Africa no longer wants help that comes with handcuffs. It wants a partnership without strings. And the nations that adapt to this model will thrive. The ones that don't, they'll be pushed to the sidelines. This is already happening. New blocs are forming. Sahel nations are coordinating outside ECOWAS. BRICS is expanding its footprint. Military cooperation is shifting toward Russia and Turkey. Infrastructure deals are flowing through China and India. Even cultural exchanges, in education, media, and technology, are moving away from Eurocentric pipelines. It's a quiet revolution, one that doesn't need bombs or speeches, just consistency. Because the African youth, who now make up the majority of the continent's population, are watching. And they are no longer moved by slogans like international community. They are asking, who showed up when it mattered? Who stayed silent? And who tried to interfere? These aren't questions for the history books, they're questions shaping real decisions right now. And this leads to an even more uncomfortable truth. Standing with Africa now means giving up control. It means no longer assuming that your endorsement is necessary. It means engaging on equal footing, or not being invited at all. That's why the divide is not just between old empires and new friends. It's between those who are willing to evolve and those who insist on clinging to an expired role. The coup that failed in Burkina Faso succeeded in something far bigger. It drew a map, a new geopolitical map where influence isn't measured in military bases or aid budgets, but in trust. Loyalty is earned through respect, not dominance. So who still plays empire? It's the nations that define African success as conformity, that punishes leaders who don't follow the model, that close embassies as warnings and reopen them only when convenient. Their strategy is clear: maintain control or walk away. But who stands with Africa? It's the ones who arrive in storms, not just sunshine. The ones who don't need Africa to fit a model to believe in it. The ones who understand that the future isn't in managing Africa, it's in listening to it. And now, as the dust settles, as the echoes of the failed coup fade, this standard, this line, remains. It's no longer enough to avoid meddling. If you're not standing with Africa, you're standing in the way. Do you think Traoré has officially changed Africa's future? Let us know in the comment section, and be honest. Isn't bowing to the West officially a thing of the past? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.